Right, so welcome to tonight's tasting. Lots of familiar faces. If I haven't met you before, my name's Liz Whedon. I'm the General Manager here at Glengarry, and we're delighted to have you along with us tonight. And I'm joined by Regan McCaffrey. Regan looks after our fine wine. Is normally based at our Victoria Park store. He's obviously, as you can see, based at home currently, and doing an amazing job along with a number of our team that are normally doing different things, looking after the back end of our customer services. Sorry, excuse me. So just before we get started, one thing I did want to share with you, and I do need a sip of something right now, so it's probably appropriate that I have a sip of this, is I've got a glass of champagne here in front of me. And you might say, why have I got a glass of champagne? Which I will, hold on, clear that frog in my throat. I've just done an Instagram live tasting tonight on champagne, and just wanted to share with you that had in that the Lilbert, and this is the latest shipment that's just arrived. It's based on a 2016 vintage, and it's looking incredible, which is a nice sort of segue into me remembering to tell you that we have the most massive champagne sale on at the moment. And if you're sitting there thinking it's not Christmas, why are we doing a champagne sale? This is a little bit early. Nothing's normal right now. So we decided that why not? Our containers had arrived and we have a bucket load of champagne. So we thought, you know what? We may as well do it in lockdown. Sounds like a good idea. So it's on for 5 days, but do jump online and have a look. There's some amazing deals there. So on to why are we tasting the collection of wines that we've got tonight? Well, all of these wines have recently arrived. And, you know, one thing we would normally do as a team when new containers arrive is we'd crack open the latest vintage, we'd have a taste together and we'd enjoy chatting about them. And, you know, I was sitting there the other day thinking, I'm missing that. And then chatting to Regan, we concurred that we were both missing it. And we were sitting there talking about some things that had arrived. And by the end of the conversation, we got to about 8 wines. And I said, there's a tasting. Let's see if we can find some other people to come join us online and indulge us in just tasting the most eclectic collection of wines that don't really go together other than their new releases. So that's why we've got this lineup. It's a really interesting lineup of wines, and I think, you know, it's going to show the diversity of what Glengarry imports. So these are wines that Glengarry has selected and imported, and as such, they've all come in refrigerated containers, which is just so important. If you haven't seen yet our graph that we've been sharing of the temperature recording of our containers, it shows, you know, a 2-degree band of stock moving and taking almost 4 months to get from France to New Zealand, but being in a refrigerated container that importantly is turned on. So if anyone says they're shipping in refrigerated containers, do ask them if they're turning it on. You can imagine how much this costs, because the container is, you know, they're not taking the usual transit time to get to New Zealand. They're taking months, and they have to be plugged in the entire way. It's the costs would absolutely blow your mind, but it's important. Why pay for these wines? And none of these wines that we're looking at tonight are at the value end of the market. Why ship them and not look after them is our view. So yeah, we do ship everything in reefers, and reefers on top of that are an absolute pain in the neck to find at the moment because there's none. But anyway, enough on that. So what we're going to do for the tasting is we're going to work through the wines one at a time. Regan and I are going to alternate so that you don't need to listen to one of us repetitively. If you haven't done a tasting with us before, one thing you do need to do is you've got on the little bottles, it'll say flight 1, glass 1, 2, 3, 4. It is ideal if you have enough glasses to pour the first flight, so 4 wines, but at least have poured right now flight 1, glass 1. and then we'll go one by one as we go through, okay? Normally you'd have us pouring for you at a tasting. So all you've got to do tonight is make sure that you're looking at the wine that we're talking about. Otherwise it's not going to make any sense at all. Right, so is everyone happy so far? Yeah? Okay, I've got some thumbs up and I've got some nodding. Excellent, perfect. Right, Regan, should we talk about the first wine?
Yeah, thanks, Liz. I'd also say in your flight too, if you've got those bottles out and handy, take the lids off them now. What we have seen with these bottles, because we're bottling these wines under argon, when you take the top off that and pour it into your glass, it's effectively as if you've just pulled the cork on it yourself. So they're very fresh. They've seen no air whatsoever. And so they will get a lot better with air. So even just the near act of opening the top of it over the kind of 30, 40 minutes before we get to those wines, that'll help open them up a little bit as well. Right. So we've only got one white wine tonight, and we're starting with, I think it might be close to one of the most expensive wines in the tasting. And this is a wine from Domaine Didier Dagueneau, who's one of the most famous producers in the entire world for Sauvignon Blanc. So a little bit like bringing ice to Eskimos, what we've got here is one of the finest Sauvignon Blancs in the world. Now, Didier Dagueneau, he was kind of there's not many winemakers in history who have been noted as being kind of so bullish, brazen, roguish, renegade. These are all kind of names that have been associated with Didier Dagueneau. He was also known as the wild man of the Loire. If you look up a photo of him, he had this crazy long hair, big beard, kind of Bruce Springsteen mullet going on, had the headband kind of tied around there, often had little charms and stuff hanging off his hair, really a man of his own style. And he was known for incredible risk-taking, his high standards, incredible attention to detail, this kind of zealous allegiance to his terroir, and this willingness to take a stand against convention and go against everything that everybody was doing in the Loire Valley at the time. So he was the fourth generation in a family of wine growers who had been making wine in the Loire Valley. And in the Loire, obviously one of the primary white wine varieties is Sauvignon Blanc. Also really well known for their Cabernet Franc and also their Chenin Blanc as well. Now, he didn't want to go into the family business, didn't want to make wine initially. And what he did was he left his hometown at a young age, and the family kind of grew up about halfway between the Loire and Burgundy. And when he left town, he wanted to do anything but make wine. And he went on and he raced motorcycle sidecars on the international circuit between about 1977 and 1982. Really, really good on that. One of his other passions was dog sled racing. And he competed internationally for many years throughout the winters. He was actually the winner of, I think, both the European Championships and the World Championships of dog sled racing. Now, what he did, he returned to his village in Saint-Andelaine in 1982. That's just outside of Pouilly-sur-Loire, so right in the center of the Loire Valley there. And he, rather than going into work for the family business, wanted to set up his own business. And there's all sorts of various stories about why he wanted to do this. He once said in an interview with a guy who said, "Why do you want to make wine?" He said, "For the chicks," so this is the kind of guy he was. He also said that he went into making his own wine because he wanted to show the rest of the family what real wine was. And he obviously didn't think too highly of what they were making. So he was really influenced by the legend Henri Jayer of Burgundy. And he quickly found his own style there. He brought a number of vineyards. I think his first vineyard that he began to vinify was in 1982. And he was one of the first in the whole Loire Valley to start doing single vineyard, single parcel wines of Sauvignon Blanc. So he bought 1.2 hectares, I think, in 82. In 85, he added the Silix vineyard, which is probably his most famous wine. And in 1988, the vineyard that became Pursan. And he was really experimenting with techniques for making wine. Organic viticulture, really low sulfur winemaking, which wasn't done at the time. Vineyards that were on their own rootstock, natural fermentations, lots of experiments with weird shaped barrels, like barrels that shape like cigars. Always with an open mind to all these pitfalls. And basically, everybody hated him in the region. Everybody was like, "What is Didier doing? Like, this is crazy stuff." I mean, he had a crew working the vineyards equal to about 1 person per hectare. So that's like ridiculous. That's a ratio you would find maybe at one of the top domains in Burgundy, like Loire or Domaine de la Romanée-Conti. But that was maybe like double or 3 times the amount of people that you would have working the land in the Loire at the time there. He was keeping the yields incredibly low, about half as much wine to 75% as much wine from the vineyard as all of his neighbors were doing. The soils always worked by plow, either by hand or by horse as well, encouraging those roots to go really deep there. Whenever they were doing replanting, he would only select really old rootstock and the best Marseille selection. So look at which individual vines made the best wine and then just cut just off all of those. So super interesting guy. Also Sauvignon Blancs that have always been raised and fermented in oak barrels right from the start. So if you haven't already, let's give this a try. Mm. Well, for a lot of New Zealand wine drinkers, there's not much that's Sauvignon Blanc about that wine at all. And he's always done things really, really different. Now, this at $126 a bottle is his entry-level wine. This is the first wine in the range. So the region where we are here is Poulet Fumé. That's the kind of the heart and the soul of everything he does. But this wine itself isn't a Poulet Fumé. Now, he's always kind of argued with the authorities over the years. In fact, this wine used to be called Dagueneau Blanc Fume de Poulet, rather than being called Poulet Fumé. And that's again because he argued with the authorities. Often they didn't accept his wine into the appellation control, and he would have to resubmit it. And so what he used was this name Blanc Fume de Poulet, which was the really old name for the region, to differentiate his wine from everybody else who was making wine. So it was still a legal name, but it was different because he said that the quality of the wines that his neighbors were making just wasn't the same as his, and he didn't want to have the same name on the bottle. So this is the kind of guy he was. Now, unfortunately, in I think September the 17th, 2008, tragedy struck and Didier was killed in a microlight crash. He also used to fly microlights as well. And he used to fly quite a bit over the Bordeaux and the Cognac area, and he actually crashed his microlight into a vineyard in Cognac. So a really, really sad day. A visionary winemaker, basically, for the world. When you talk to a lot of winemakers around the world, they say Didier Dagueneau was one of the greatest who we've ever seen. Now, he was survived by his son, his daughter Charlotte, and his son Louis Benjamin. And both of them had kind of grown up in the winery. And Louis had also worked alongside his father for many vintages as well, and really absorbed his perfectionist attitudes as well. But obviously there's enormous shoes to fill coming after somebody like his father, and the whole world was waiting to see what would happen. And the 2008 vintage, I think Didier had started that but not finished it. 2009 was the first for Louis Benjamin, and the wines were incredible. And it certainly looks like since then he's just gone from strength to strength, and we're seeing wines out of Domaine Didier Dagueneau that are better than anything that we saw from Didier himself. So I think he'd be really proud of how his son's kind of progressed in there. They've made a lot of changes in the winery as well, things like putting solar panels on the roof, doing a lot of modernization, moving even further down that biodynamic, sustainable path than Dad did. But in terms of the wine quality, this is the only wine out of the whole range that's not a single vineyard wine. So it's not soil specific and it's not terroir specific. So this wine's produced from the fruit of 4 different vineyards that he has. So 2 are plots just on the other side of the Saint-Andelin hill. One's about 20-year-old Sauvignon Blanc vines on flinty kind of clay soils. And the other's in a Ludi on the other side of the river, which is limestone and kind of white clay soils. And then it's blended together with some young vine parcels as well from Saint-Andelin itself. Now, you might notice that this isn't called Blanc Fume de Poulet, right? And so Louis has kind of followed on in his father's footsteps of also not getting on very well with authority. And what happens in France, or certainly in Poulet Fumé, or actually in all of France where you've got an AOC, what you have to do is each year you have to submit your wines to the tasting panel for the appellation control, and that'll be tasted by a panel of experts, and those experts will assess the wine for quality, for faults, and to make sure it's typical of the wines of the region. And in 2017, Louis Benjamin released his wines, or gave his wines to the tasting panel, and they were rejected. Every single wine that he gave to them was rejected for not being typical of the region. Now, one of the things that happens is he holds his wines back for quite a long time. This is a 2018 Sauvignon Blanc we're tasting here. So he was submitting his 2017s while other people were submitting 2019s and 2020s. So they're going to have a really, really different taste to them. And they rejected him, sent the wines back and said, you're welcome to submit another sample or, protest this, go up to evaluation. And what Louis Benjamin did was he just pulled all of his wines from the appellation and said, none of my wines anymore are going to be poulet fumé. Every single one of my wines is going to be declassified to a simple Vin de France. And Vin de France is the absolute lowest tier of wine that you can get in France. So this is the basic level of table wine, the cheapest of the cheap from the supermarket. So he really gave the big middle finger to the authorities there and said, my wines can stand on their own. They don't need to be appellation poulet fumé. I'm going to just call them Vin de France. And so he called this wine, instead of Blanc de Poulet, just Blanc, etc., which is quite funny. Now, you see on that label there, it's a little bit hard to see in that picture, but the front of the labels always had this beautiful piece of music on it. And that musical score on the label was composed by a guy called Francois Christian. And he was a musical friend of Didier Dagueneau's. Now, it was written for the trumpet in B flat major and the French horn in F major. And the first line of it is a famous song by a famous French songwriter called Georges Brassens. And then the next four lines after that are his friend Christian's personal interpretation of that theme. So Didier had always done these interesting things with his wines. Silex, for example, his most famous wine, literally just has a piece of rock, a picture of a piece of stone on the front, which is a piece of stone taken out of the vineyard. Pur sang literally means thoroughbred. And there's a picture of the horse on the front, which is a picture of the horse from one of the famous cave paintings. Ancient cave paintings from the south of France there. So they've always done things super differently. Now, in terms of making this particular wine here, this is a wine that's really improved dramatically since Louis Benjamin took over. I think the quality of this now is far closer to the quality of the top wines, which are sitting in more that 180 to 250 kind of price range now. So this was fermented in a mix of barrels, new barrels, 3 to 4 year old barrels, and some of them the famous cigar shaped barrels. So Didier designed these barrels that were shaped like a long cigar, like completely flat like that, to really increase the proportion of lees aging that you would get in there. Gives you that nutty kind of creamy texture that you get out of this wine that's really, really different from there. Then after it's had that time sitting in those barrels, it sits on the lees for a really, really long time. And then he matures it in a mix of these really big wooden tanks and stainless steel tanks as well before it all gets kind of blended together. And you can see you get this incredible texture on the palate of this wine, but awesome length as well. These are wines that you can absolutely age 10 years, no problem for a Dagueneau Sauvignon Blanc. Some of the first wines that Didier made from the 1980s are still drinkable today. So for me, I think about 10 years is when they start to get, 8 to 10 years is when they start to get really interesting, probably best in that 8 to 15 year range. If you want to keep them a bit longer, you can though as well. But then you're really starting to get into old white wine territory, and it's quite different. But it's always awesome to taste a Dagueneau, and these just arrived. So we were certainly really, really keen to put this in the tasting. What do you think of this one, Liz? This is our first taste of this vintage, I think, from Dagueneau.
Yeah, exactly. I think the incredible thing with it is just the texture of the wine. I think any New Zealand winemaker looking at that would look at it with great detail as to how are they just getting that palate weight and the length to it. And I think, it's worth noting our biggest customer base for the Didier Dagueneau wines when they arrive is New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc winemakers.
Yeah, it always goes to winemakers for comparative tastings is where a lot of them go to.
Yeah. So this is very much held at the highest esteem of a benchmark for Sauvignon Blanc. And, when you look at just how far removed it is from the majority of what we see here, in fact, all of what we see here, it's incredible. It's fantastic. Very, very cool wine.
Yeah.
Okay.
Beautiful.
Is everyone happy so far? Yep. Should we go on to red wine? We're going to go on to red wine and stay there. It was just an interlude with the white wine first because it's fun. Okay, cool. So we're going to a second wine. So the second wine is Bruno Giacoso, and it is the Dolcetto De Alba 2020. Now, just before we come to sort of Dolcetta and talk about this wine particularly, a little bit of context first of all, and let's start with where it is and the producer himself, because this is another really iconic producer. I think sadly, Regan, we've started with two that have died. So we're not going to do well through these stories because everyone's dying through them. But so we're now in Piedmont, so northern Italy. So the wine region that sits, if you sort of look at a map of Italy and look at where Turin is up in the north, and then head towards the French border, and it's about an hour and a half drive. That's the Piedmont wine region. So the grape variety that is most at home here, or is the iconic variety, is Nebiolo. We're not, of course, looking at Nebiolo tonight, but it's a really important part of the story. Nebbiolo's an amazing grape variety. It's not dissimilar in a way to Pinot Noir, but it does have fierce tannins, fierce acidity, and produces some really long-lived wines, and is the grape variety that's behind both Barolo and Barbaresco. Now, Barolo and Barbaresco are both villages, but they're also areas of production for wine. So you get wines that are labelled Barolo. They've come from the delimited area that is Barolo, and that could be that they come from the village of Barolo, or they come from the other villages that are permitted within that area that is the Barolo area. And one of those is Cedro De Alba, which is where this wine is from, and we'll come back to that. The other village that is significant is Barbaresco, which then you get wines labelled as Barbaresco, but also within that area, there are other villages that fall into that delimited area as well. Now, why I mentioned this is that Bruno Giacoso is one of the very few people that produced both Barolo and Barbaresco. So any travel to the region, you would notice very, very quickly the sort of staunch approach that those in Barolo have to their expression of Nebiolo, and the equally staunch approach that you have in Barbaresco to their version of Nebiolo, and never the two shall meet. So with this, I wouldn't say it's a war between the two, but it's certainly noticeable, their love for their own expression of Nebiolo. It's just not heard of to produce between the two, and let alone at the very top level of production in both areas. But that's exactly what Bruno Giacosa did. He actually sadly died in 2018 and has been survived by his daughter, Bruna. Bruna is actually supported now and continues to work with Dante Scaglione, and Dante was the enologist working for Bruno, and has continued to work for his daughter Bruna. There was a period there, 2008 to 2011, where Dante wasn't there. And when you talk to them about it, they cite that there was some differences in opinion. Fortunately, the differences in opinion were resolved because Dante is one very, very smart enologist. Bruno Giacosa, though, he didn't learn his craft from going to university or from studying winemaking. He learned it from his father, Marion, and his grandfather, Carlo. And actually at age 13, he was working in the winery. And 2 years after that, he was working in the winery full time. And in a lot of interviews that he did, he was sort of asked, you know, what was the key thing you learnt from your father and your grandfather? What is the real, I guess, secret behind why your wines are so legendary? And, you know, Bruno Giacoso wines sell for thousands of dollars a bottle and are very sought after. You know, what is the secret? And he said it's all about the fruit. It's about where the fruit comes from. And he said that's what he learned from his father, was where to get the fruit. Because up until 1982, everything that went into a Bruno Giacosa wine was from purchased grapes. They didn't own any vineyard land until 82. And it was only in 82 that they bought their first vineyard. And the reason they did that is sort of from that period and through the 90s, there was a real move in the Piedmont region to move away from sort of blending from fruit that came from across an area to actually estate bottling and also bottling individual crus. It became a lot more like the Burgundian framework that, you know, some of you would be very familiar with. And on that, he decided to purchase some land. And of course, it was always going to be very interesting with Bruno Giacosa having purchased fruit across the region. When he came to actually put some money into buying a bit of dirt, where was he going to buy it? So in Barbaresco, he bought in Asili, in the Cru of Asili, and he also bought in the Cru of Rabaya. And Rabaya is quite interesting because the next wine that we're going to look at sits very, very close to Rabaya, the de Gresy wine. In Barolo, he bought in Falleto de Serralunga de Alba. And Serralunga is one of the villages within the Barolo area that is known for the most powerful, strong, long-lived wines. They're certainly very, very acidic and very tannic. And that's where he chose to purchase in Barolo, which is very interesting. You know, something like Lamora, that village would be a lot more approachable, younger, and certainly very attractive. And I can, you know, only imagine what a Giacosa wine from Lamora would be like. It'd be quite charming, I'd say. But he didn't go for that. He went for the most long-lived. Now, when he did this, he also changed the naming of the wines. And you have Agricola Falleto de Bruno Giacosa, which represents any of the wines that are off vineyards that he owns. So if you see that on the label, that's an indication that he owns the vineyard. It also has to do with a tax break, because in the region, if you set up an agricultural property, so something that is agritourism, so you let people come and it's like a sort of B&B type thing, then you get tax breaks. So he set his business up, that his vineyards that he owned, as essentially an agritourism business, which then affords him some tax breaks. But anyway, it helps us know which ones have come off land that he owned. Then you get Casa Vina Bruno Giacosa, which is then the wines that are made from purchased grapes. Now, slowly over time, the purchased ones will disappear and it will all become estate, is what the intent is there.
So Liz, this is the first time that this wine, the Dolcetto, that we've got it as an estate wine, isn't it? Because the previous times
Yes.
we've had it, it's been negotiant grapes. This is the first Falleto.
Yes, yeah. And what's interesting with this, so having said that, you know, the great grape variety from this region is Nebiolo, what we've chosen to have a look at tonight is the Dolcetto De Alba. Now, a couple of reasons for doing that. His Barolos and Barbarescos, as I said before, are $1,000 a bottle. That's one of the issues with including it in a tasting tonight. But also, we do have them sold, or most of them with names on them, I believe. So they're very sought after. But what we have managed to get a bigger allocation of this year, which we're really delighted with, is the Dolcetta. And normally with Dolcetta, you know, it's the wine that you'd have in a wine bar in Piedmont, and you'd have it slightly chilled, and it'd be a nice fun thing that you'd do, and you wouldn't look at it seriously. Well, anything with a Bruno Giacoso name on the label, you need to look at seriously, and this is a very serious Dolcetta. It still does have all the characteristics that you'd expect with this variety. The grape variety actually has a little bit of a nickname in Piedmont, and it's known as the little sweetie, because the wines do have that lovely sweetness to the fruit. They really do have a sort of cherry violet characteristic to it. And I think this comes out perfectly in this wine. So should we have a little taste before I go on? Yeah, that's a very serious wine for a Dolcetta. Well, the character of cherries, it's like when you get those really sort of big black cherries and you bite into them and they're almost meaty, they're like crunchy. It's got that characteristic, I think, definitely. It's spent 12 months in French oak, 25% of that is new. So that's quite a lot of oak usage for a Dolcetta. Not something that would normally happen. It would normally see a whole lot of stainless steel, be rushed to bottle, and be served chilled, as I said, in a local wine bar. It also, of course, is from Falleto de Serralonga. So that area I spoke about before, where the Barolos that come from the region are really intense and really concentrated. This is fruit coming off just near his famed vineyard with the Nebiolo in it. Being Dolcetta, it doesn't have the acidity or the tannin that Nebiolo will have. The acidity here, I've written down in my notes from tasting it before, that the acidity is quite agile, and the tannins are quite taut. And I think when you look at it, it's all of that fruit, the acidity's there, and then it's got a nice structure around it. But it's a great wine to be enjoying this summer. This is not one that, you need to put in the cellar and wait a long time to enjoy. This is a drink now wine. And yeah, Anne-Marie, I agree, a Beaujolais sort of vibe to it. Yeah, the fruit's all there, but it's just got an impressive structure. What do you think, Regan? It's your...
Yeah, this is no oak, all stainless fermentation, isn't it? Doesn't taste like there's any...
No, there's oak there. Okay. It's actually spent 12 months in some oak, and actually even got some new oak, which is just really unusual for Dolcetta.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and also I think shows you how seriously they take this wine. Yeah, I agree with you though. Although the notes tell us that there's oak, I think
it's so well integrated. I mean, like you said, like those really pure fruit, like almost Kirshy cherry characters are coming through. Yeah, like really impressive for a Dolcetta.
And great value for money. I think it's going to stand up really nicely in this lineup. And is it the best value wine of the lineup? I think so. I can't remember. It'll be getting close. Oh, very good. Does anyone like it? Yeah, okay, we've got some nodding going on. This is good. Yep, lots of nodding. Okay, love it. Perfect. Thanks, Richard. I was thinking there for a minute that, it was just me. Excellent. John likes it too. I must confess, actually, I wrote a whole thing on Giacosa recently for an offer that we did, and I got to the end of writing it, and I'm very fortunate to have a Glengarry store not too far from me. It's only 3 blocks. And they had a bottle of this in stock. And after spending the afternoon writing about it, I went up and got a bottle of this. So my husband and I found no difficulty in enjoying it now. It's a very easy wine to drink. So, cool. Right, where are we going next, Regan? Still sticking in Italy?
Yes, well, we're sticking in not only in Italy, but we're sticking in Piedmont as well. And as Liz said, a couple of Giacosa's most famous vineyards, the Rabbiar and the Asili, are literally right above the winery we're about to taste now. So glass number 3 is the Marchesi di Gresy, Monte Colombo, Barbera d'Asti. I think it's a Barbera d'Asti Superiore, actually. So his history, or the history of the estate here, goes back significantly further than the Giacosa family. So the Gresy family first acquired the Monte Arabaldo estate in Treso in 1650, and the Martinenga estate, where they're based today, they acquired that in 1797 when it was donated to them by the Marquis de Abat. And when that was donated to them in 1797, this Martinenga estate was already back then one of the most famous vineyards in all of Italy. And it's been famous since Roman times. The Romans were farming those exact same slopes, and there was a small farmhouse, a villa at the bottom of the slope, right where the winery is now, that was known as Villa Martis. And they've still got a wine that's called Villa Martis to this day. And this is just an incredible vineyard, one of the best vineyards in all of Barbaresco. And it's a single cru, so Martinenga is a monopole. It's entirely owned by the Marchesi di Gresy, and it produces some of the best Barbarescos in the region. As I said, Rabaiar and Asili, which are also two of the greatest, just at the top as you come around this bowl of the vineyard itself. So the estate, they started with Martinenga in 1797, and now they've got 4 properties across Piedmont. Now, before about 1960, the estate basically was a traditional farm. It had livestock, it had vegetables and fruits, and it also had grapes. And in the 1950s and 1960s, the De Gresy family used to sell these grapes to all of the finest wine producers in the region. And that was the tradition in Milangi. You had people who made wine, but the people who made wine didn't own vineyards. They didn't grow the grapes at the same time. So it was in the early kind of 1970s that Alberto De Gresy basically realized the potential of the vineyards that he had and decided, well, we should be vinifying our own grapes, making our own wine. So the first vintage made by De Gresy themselves off their own fruit was 1973. And he wanted to transfer that kind of class and character of the terroir, the vineyards and the varietal into the bottle. Now, Alberto's son and daughter, they started, I think, in 2013. So this is still family owned. The estate's been entirely family owned since 1797. And now they've got 111 acres, there's acres of vineyards across these 4 estates. Now, one of these 4 estates is an estate called the Monte Colombo estate, and that's in Barbera d'Asti. Now, Barbera d'Asti, or the province of Asti, there's like 67 or 68 municipalities across Asti. And the major grape variety grown in the Asti province of Piedmont is Barbera, right? So Barbera d'Asti literally means the Barbera grape from Asti. It got DOC status in 1970 and DOCG status, the top status in Italy, it got in 2008. Now, under those DOCG rules, you've got to have a minimum of 90% Barbera in the blend. The balance, you can make it up with either Griganola, Fresia, or Dolcetto. But this particular wine is 100% Barbera. And it's also, strictly speaking, I don't have the bottle here, but it will be a Barbera d'Asti Superiore, which will be what it'll have on the little neck tag because of the amount of time that it's been aged for. This is a really serious Barbera d'Asti. So often a little bit like the Dolcetta we just had, when people think Barbera d'Asti, they often think soft, easy drinking, early drinking wine. And this is anything but that. This is a serious, serious wine. So let's give it a taste. You can see that seriousness just on the nose. Wow, that's a big wine. You can see why we put it in the order we have. Now, the vineyards from this Monte Colombo estate, they were abandoned for a very, very long time until a guy called Franco Benzo, who was a childhood friend, basically, of Alberto De Gresy, he gave the producer the opportunity to use them. I think in the early 1980s. and they replanted them again in 1998, I think, because the old plantings that were done there were too far apart and they weren't really suited up for quality. But they've got an awesome position here. You've got excellent climate, you've got this great soil profile, and this splendid southern exposure, which exposes the whole slope to the sun all day long. Now, this is a pretty traditional vinification for a red wine in the region. You've got temperature-controlled fermentation and stainless steel. It's not a super long maceration, 10 days. They're pumping over the skin all the time to get that color out. Goes through full malolactic fermentation in stainless. But where this differs from your regular Barbera, that will only maybe go into hardly any oak at all, if it is, it's quite old oak. This all goes into 100% French barriques from Allier, and it's 18 months in those barriques. And I think about 25% of those is new. And then it has a further 6 months of resting in larger barriques before it gets released after that. And those larger barriques, I think, are Slovenian oak. Yeah, they are. So it's French barriques actually for the first 12 months. And then it has 16 months in Slovenian oak. And the Slovenian oak is older oak and it's massive barrels. So those French barrels are around about that 275 litre, whereas the Slovenian oak are like 1,500 litre barrels. So they're massive barrels. And so this is about as serious as it gets for a Barbera d'Asti. Marchesi de Gresy themselves say that you can age this wine for somewhere between 15 and 20 years, which that's really, really long time for a Barbera. But as you can see, it's a wine that they also hold back for a long time. So this is the 2014, and this is current release from de Gresy. So they realize that this wine needs a lot of time. So they also hold it back for quite a bit longer before they release it. So when they release it to the market, that's when they think it's just starting to drink well. And then it's up to you to see how long you want to cellar it for from this point. Now, interesting thing about de Gresy as well is the cellar master there, since the turn of the millennium, since about 2000, so over 20 years now, is a New Zealander called Jeff Chilcott. And he basically went over to Europe on a working holiday, somehow ended up at Marchesi de Gresy and never left. So he tries to come back. Usually we see him back here in Auckland every year. And Jeff is a legend in the wine scene worldwide. Everyone knows Jeff, and Jeff knows everyone. If you go to his place, you better be prepared to drink wine, and lots of it, until very, very early in the morning or very, very late at night. He's pretty legendary for the amount of wine that he can drink, the amount of wine that he makes you drink, the amount of food that he makes you eat. You'll go from one restaurant to another, eating and drinking, and then you'll go to a tasting, and it just goes on and on and on. So Jeff is a legend, not only in Piedmont, but also kind of around the world. Most of the top winemakers of the world all seem to be friends with Jeff. So he's a guy, if you ever get to meet him, he's got some amazing stories.
Yeah, cool. Very, very, very good wine, Regan, and I think lovely to talk about Jeff. He did, I think, optimistically send, with the latest stock that arrived, some samples for him to enjoy with us over the summer, because he hopes he can travel here soon. But I think it's a little bit too optimistic, and the good news is that, looking at the wines he's sent, they will age beautifully until when he next can get here. And absolute fantastic wine. And you're right, a night with Jeff, yes.
Is it a night to remember, or a night that you can't remember? So it's both.
I remember one night, actually, we one little story, we were talking about Barbaresco before, and we got to some sweet sort of spot in the early hours of the morning, and I was thinking, we're going home, because we'd left where we were going. And he said, no, he said, we need champagne. This is what you do at 3 a.m. And I said, well, who are we going to drink champagne with at 3 a.m.? And he said, with the mayor. And sure enough, we were then in a bar in the middle of Barbaresco, drinking gosse with the mayor, whose wife had just given birth, and that was what was happening. Yeah. Anyway, crazy times. Jeff is doing well though during lockdown, and despite the fact that obviously COVID hit Italy really hard and in this region very hard early on. Actually, what they did at Gresy, which is really interesting, they have just built a hotel or accommodation near the winery, and for all of their staff that they knew they were going to need through harvest and to keep the business going, they quarantined everyone into the hotel, including the chef, and it's a 5-star hotel. So De Gresy have been living in their own bubble with no contact with anyone else, with the chef cooking for them and all the staff living in the hotel. Jeff said it's been fantastic.
He probably doesn't want any tourists to come back.
Oh, I think he's looking for everyone to be able to travel again. But yeah, it also, I think, goes to explain the family behind De Gresy and who they are, that, you know, their idea of what they were doing was to look after everyone and keep them all there. Oh, awesome. Right. So I think we've done Italy. Is everyone happy with Italy? Yep. Okay. We're going to move to Portugal now. And just a little bit on Portuguese wine before we get into the particular wine that we're going to look at, and just welcome to start tasting it while I just give you a little bit of information on Portuguese wine. But know that we are looking at Portuguese wine, not fortified wine, and we will come to a fortified Portuguese wine, so a port at the end of a tasting. But this is probably the hardest category in the world to sell, and it shouldn't be, because there is a tendency to pick up a red wine from Portugal and assume that it is going to be fortified. This is not. And Portugal actually has a very, very long history of winemaking. It actually dates back to 2000 BC, but it's a history that we haven't had that much to do with, because it has been, in terms of production until recently, very much consumed within Portugal. It's a relatively small part of the Iberian Peninsula. It does have influences from the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, and also there's a continental impact there as well. Probably one of the most significant things with Portuguese wine is that Indigenous varieties are very much key here, and the wine that we're looking at, although it does have some Syrah in it, is predominantly from Indigenous grape varieties. So in Portugal, one of the sort of early influences was the British wine merchants, and that actually came about when King John I from Portugal actually married Philippa of Lancaster. And then and this is, I'm going to give you the very condensed version of this, but there's some key bits in it that relate to what we're looking at here. In 1386, there was a diplomatic alliance between Portugal and England. And what that actually allowed for is the English to reside in Portugal. And when you walk through vineyards and wineries in Portugal today, you know, you will hear a very English accent switch very easily between English and Portuguese. And that really speaks to the history of the production area here. 1703, that was a significant milestone, because at that point there were lower taxes on Portuguese wine than on French wine into the UK. And that started a lot of export of Portuguese wine, and it was all going very well. Then sort of the second part of the 18th century, there was rapid growth in the shipments of wine. But then, of course, in 1845 and the period from there, phylloxera hit, and the Portuguese industry was also hit by odium at the same time. So two pests that just devastated the vineyard lands. Now, at that time, one significant thing happened, which relates to Quinta de Noval, is they have one vineyard that is pre-phylloxera, so pre this point, and it's called Nacional. And the reason it's called Nacional is that rather than turning, as a lot of people did at that time, to use American rootstocks, they have one part of the vineyard that they turned to use Portuguese rootstocks. Now that's significant because unfortunately the American rootstocks that came in to replant a lot of parts of Portugal contained more and more disease and devastated more parts of Portugal. So this part that they call Nacional at Quinta de Noval has Portuguese rootstock. So it's very, very unique, but it creates the old vines that go into their top port. Now, the next significant milestone was in 1986 when Portugal joined the EU. And I remember I actually travelled to Portugal, not at that time, but a little bit later. And it was shortly after things started to change. And what I found were these wine lists where all of the wines on the wine list were Portuguese. And there was just incredible stocks of old Portuguese wine, because before they joined the EU, all they drank was their own wine. And you had this wonderful culture of Portuguese food and wine until they joined the EU. The restrictions on trade were removed, and now you have probably a more, I guess, modern view of restaurants there where you have wines from all over the world. But it was certainly a great place to visit in sort of the mid-90s when you know, it was all just about the local cuisine. The other thing that happened at the same time was that the restrictions on production practices were changed to meet the EU standards, which changed how wine was made in Portugal. Now, the wine that we've got tonight comes from the Douro Valley. There's lots of different growing areas within Portugal, and we could do an entire evening on Portuguese wine. But this is from the Douro, so from where fortified wine is also produced. And it's actually a UNESCO heritage site or region that's been recognised by UNESCO. Wine's been produced there for some 2,000 years. And in fact, in, I think it was 1757, around 1757, 1760, they classified the vineyards in Maduro and classified them into different quality levels. And that was actually the first demarcated and regulated wine region in the world. So very progressive, despite the fact that to some extent, the wine production in Portugal has been quite isolated. Now, the producer that we're looking at tonight is Quinta de Noval. They're located near Pinhal in the Douro. They've got 145 hectares, very well known for their fortified wines, but also recognised as, through the sort of period from 1970 to 1980, as not being a producer that you would really have had any interest in or been keen to try their wines or their ports. So they had there. Fortunately, in 93, things changed, and what changed was AXA Insurance bought this property. And the technical director they put in charge of this is Christian Seeley. And Christian, of course, is the technical director in charge of properties like Pichon-Baron and Pauillac and Bordeaux, also of Cedro and Sauterne, of Disnoco and Tokai as well. So Christian said that, you know, when he arrived there, he sort of looked at it and thought, there's great terroir here. The vineyards are good. And he famously said, you know, half of what makes Pichon-Baron brilliant is the vineyard land. The other half is what we grow on it and what we do with it. And they really did take on some very nice vineyards, but the vineyards were very poorly. So they went through a period of getting them, working with the vineyards and getting the techniques to what they wanted. So this wine is called Cedro. That name comes from a cedar tree that's in the middle of the vineyard. It is made from principally Portuguese varieties. So the predominant grape variety is actually Regan Nacional. So let's have a taste of it if you haven't. Yeah. So it's 50% Touriga. Touriga is one of the most prestigious grape varieties of the indigenous varieties and produces some of the finest ports. Touriga has insane acidity, tannins, and it has some characteristics that are similar in a way to Cabernet Sauvignon, but it always has sort of a Christmas cake character to it. So the fruit is always tastes not raisined, it's the wrong way to put it, but it has sort of a spicy characteristic to it. So this is 50% Touriga Nacional, 20% Touriga Francesca, 5% Tinta, which is essentially Tempranillo, and then 25% Syrah. And Syrah is not a common grape variety, but it's one that Christian really feels does very well in Maduro and contributes nicely to this wine. It's had stainless steel fermentation and then 11 months in French oak. Only 8% of that oak was new, so a relatively small amount of new oak. And it's got an ABV of 14%, and it is fermented completely dry, so no residual sugar in this one. So what do we think?
Yeah, delicious.
Mm.
Quite different to what I was expecting. Like, it's been quite some time since we've had some of these Portuguese dry reds in. Though, to be honest, being from Quinta de Noval, I should have expected that it was going to be pretty elegant, and it is. I mean, the way that it all sits together, it's got huge power and structure, but it's not over the top. It's not overly oaky. It's, yeah, beautiful. Chocolate Anne-Marie, that would be nice, actually. Nice match.
Yeah, it's got a dusty sort of cacao characteristic to it. I think back to, this was a few years ago, but I judged at the International Wine and Spirit Challenge in London, and one of the categories I got to judge was Portuguese red wines, and I was just in heaven. I sort of started and was thinking, okay, am I just tasting wrong today, because I'm essentially awarding all of these gold medals? What on earth is wrong? I can't find anything that's not good. And then I got to the end of it, and it was quite a daunting character that I had as my team leader. And I sort of thought, how do I read my scores out? I could be completely miscuing here. And I thought, no, got to judge with confidence. And I read them out and they went, you're spot on. These are outstanding. And it is, Portuguese red wine, what's coming out of there at the moment, and the value as well. That's a whole heap of wine for that price point. It's crazy. Very good. Right, everyone happy? Yeah, I've got plenty of thumbs up. This is brilliant. Okay,
right.
Cool.
Flight 2.
Should we do it? Okay,
Yeah,
I'll give you a couple of seconds, guys, to pour your wines. Again, if you can pour all 4, that'd be brilliant. But if not, at least get the next one ready. And then we'll be back in 2 seconds to do the next flight. Cool?
Interesting with that last wine, we've got Kyle in the tasting tonight, who did all the filling of the bottles for this tasting, and he told me a couple of days ago actually that the Cedro, when he opened that, was straight out of the bottle, not showing much at all, really closed. And he's saying, like, having it sitting in the glass here for 30 or 40 minutes, giving it a bit of swirl time, he said it's a completely different wine with air than it was when he first opened it out of the bottle. Yeah, really interesting to see that. So it's clearly a wine that needs some time. Right, 4 wines in front of us now. So where are we going? We've got 1 from Bordeaux, 2 from South America. We're going Argentina, then Chile, and then we're finishing back again in Portugal. So we're going to start with glass number 1, which is the Duluc de Branaire Ducru, Bordeaux from St. Julien. And this is a really well-known estate. It's a 4th growth estate. So in the 1855 classification, this is a cru class chateau. And the history of Branaire Ducru goes back a couple of hundred years before that, even back to about 1680. And in those early days in this area of St. Julien, so St. Julien is on the left bank of Bordeaux. So it's in the Médoc, so it's on the Atlantic side of Bordeaux, so very close to the coast. really deep gravels from an old river there, and there's a lot of old swamps that were drained by the Dutch engineers in the 16th century. And where those swamps were, as well as a lot of the vineyards are today, the land was no good for anything else. Now, in 1680, Branaire Ducru was part of the massive Becheval estate, and Becheval is still a famous estate in Central Leon today. And when the owner of Becheval passed on, he left behind this massive vineyard that was seriously in debt. And so to pay the bills, the huge Becheval estate was broken up and sold to pay those debts. And you had a bunch of new estates that were created, including this one. Now, the guy who brought it was a guy called Jean-Baptiste Branaire, and it was Branaire, B-R-A-N-E-Y-R-E. And he created the estate in 1680. And the traditional custom of the day was the owner of the estate would give it the name. And so it became known as Chateau Branaire. And over time, that was later altered to Branaire, the spelling we see today. And he brought the land that we know of as it today because of the terroir. He understood that Cabernet Sauvignon particularly grows best on these deep gravels that are found here in the Medoc, whereas your Merlot and your Cabernet Franc grows best on the right bank on the more clay or limestone soils. Now, the next part of the estate was going through marriage. So you had Marie Branaire, his daughter, married a guy called Pierre Duluc, and that's where obviously the Branaire Duluc came from. And 100 years later, they finally constructed the actual winery on the property. Before then, the grapes were getting shipped somewhere else to be made. They built the chateau in 1824, and it took 200 years for the Ducru portion of the wine's name to actually make its way onto the label. So in 1875, Gustave Ducru, he was a more distant relative, he took over the property and he added his name onto it. So then finally it became Branaire Ducru. I don't think it was ever actually named Branaire Duluc, but that's where the Ducru came from. Now the estate itself, it's really increased in quality over the last few years. You've got a 60-hectare property here, and it's mostly planted to Cabernet, about 65% Cabernet planted here, 28% Merlot, Petit Verdot, Cab Franc. And it's still about the same size as it was in that 1855 classification, which is unusual. So you've got really deep gravels here with clay soils, and like the highest part of the vineyard is an earth-shattering 14 meters above sea level. So not very high at all. This terroir is kind of quite close to the chateau, and it's quite close to down to the river, the Gironde River. And they've got some blocks that are a little bit further inland next to Chateau Lagrange and Chateau Talbot, Emery. And then they've got 15 different blocks in total, 70 different parcels of vines, and reasonably old vines too. They're averaging about 35 to 40 years of age. But the oldest vines are dating back 95 years of age. Really, really close planted density here. Old vines are at about 7,000 plants per hectare, but all of the newer ones are at like 10,000. So that's really, really closely planted. And the goal of the estate is to basically convert all of the bits of the vineyards to those close plantings over time. Right, so let's give the wine a try, and then we can have a little bit of a talk about it. Oh, classic Bordeaux on the nose. Yeah, well, so that's a really excellent second wine. So what we're looking at here is not the Grand Vin of Branaire Ducru. So the Grand Vin meaning the great wine. This is the second wine. So most of the top estates in Bordeaux have something called the second wine. And the reason for these second wines, they started kind of in the 1950s through 1960s, but didn't really become popular until really the 1980s and early 1990s. And the goal of a second wine is to enable you to declassify some of the fruit, firstly from the younger vines and the particular barrels that aren't as good or perhaps don't have the character that's suited for the Grand Vin. So that means the quality of the Grand Vin stays really, really high, and you've also still got another wine to sell. And then most estates will also then sell off the wine that they don't think is good enough for that. So both of the wines, the Branaire Ducru itself and the Duluc, are both trying to express the same kind of house style. So for this, they use all of the younger vines. So any of the vines that are under 20 years of age always go into this. And then they've got a particular part of the vineyard that goes into it as well. Similar winemaking process, though. You've got 12 months in French oak barrels. Now, the major difference is that there's only 20 to 25% new oak in this wine, whereas there's more like 60% new oak in the Grand Vin. So that's one of the biggest differences. The other difference is the blend. So you can see here we're 50% Cabernet Sauvignon, 43% Merlot, 2% Cab Franc, and 5% Petit Verdot. Whereas the Grand Vin in 2017 was about the same as we had in the vineyard. I think it was 67% Cabernet. So there's always going to be more Cabernet. The best Cabernet is going to go into the Grand Vin, and there'll be a much higher percentage of Merlot in the second wine. But what we do see here is we see that huge quality that comes through from the 2017 vintage. And most of our 2017s, as you know, arrived in last year. And this wine pretty much follows the same pattern we've seen with all the others. 2017 Bordeaux, absolutely delicious wines. It's not a great vintage when you look at the vintages on either side, because on either side you've got 2015 and 2016, two of the best vintages of all time. And then on the other side, you've got 2018, 2019, and 2020, also three of the greatest vintages of all time in Bordeaux, and the only trilogy ever in Bordeaux. So 2017's sandwiched in between five of the best vintages ever made. So it was always going to be hard for it. But if it didn't have those on either side, I think we would agree that 2017 is an excellent vintage, because every single wine we have tried from this vintage has been absolutely delicious. It's all the way up to the first growths, to the entry level wines, and the wines that you can pop and pour a 2017 straight away, which you often can't do with Bordeaux. And they're going to be drinkable a lot earlier than we usually see from a great vintage in Bordeaux. So a great vintage of first growth from a great year might need 40 or 50 years, whereas in 2017 it's going to be more like 20 to 30 years. But you can see even a wine like this, the second wine, Branaire Ducru, which is only a fourth growth, and this is the second wine of the fourth growth. I mean, this is still a wine that I would happily age this for 10 years. It's just going to get better and better. It's probably not a 20-year wine, but it's definitely a 10+ year wine. So depending on where you want to drink it. But yeah, it's really showing, Liz. This is a new parcel. So you obviously just came across this recently.
Yeah, it did. And we've got a question there, which I'll talk to in 2 seconds. But yes, to answer your question, Regan, we love the 2017s when they arrived and how they were looking in bottle. And I actually did go back recently. I particularly liked this wine, and we have bought a parcel of it because I think it's, as you said, Regan, this is a wine you can cellar, but it's also a wine you can drink right now. Yeah. And, I'd be really happy with that on Christmas Day. And I think, when I was putting these containers together to hopefully arrive at this time of the year, I was thinking about, things that would be really, really good right now. So just to answer the question that was asked, in terms of the flavor profiles of this wine, there's sort of, in terms of fruit characters, two things I get a real sort of cassis character, but then also a plum characteristic to it. Also getting a bit of a sort of cedar or leathery character, which is quite typical with Bordeaux. And typically with Bordeaux, you will get quite firm acidity. So it'll, be quite vibrant, and then the tannins will be high. So the tannins being sort of that character that you'd know if you leave a tea bag in your tea for too long, and you get that drying sensation. With Bordeaux, you are going to see a high level and a very evolved nature of the tannins. It's one of the hallmarks of Bordeaux, and that acidity there, but then with that core of sort of red fruit characters. So I hope that's answered the question there, and please keep sending them through. We're very, very happy to talk all night about these wines, but we won't. We will move on. Is everyone happy with the Bordeaux? We've got, I know, some big Bordeaux lovers in the room. Is it a thumbs up or a thumbs down from those people? Yeah, okay, it's a thumbs up. This is good. Yeah, it's a drink now sort of style that can age. And I think that's what we were looking to try and see with it. So, which is good. Cool. Okay, so we're going to move completely now, and we're heading to South America, and we're heading to Argentina, and actually to Zuccardi. And Zuccardi, not that anyone can travel there, but it just won for the third year in a row the best vineyard in the world to go and visit, which is fantastic when you can't go and visit them. But if you ever are in this part of the world, it is the most incredible place to visit. And Zuccardi really are one of the most prominent winemaking families in Argentina. It was established by Alberto Zuccardi, and actually quite interesting how he got into winemaking, because he was an engineer, knew nothing about winemaking, but he specialized in irrigation. And when you remember that, or you think that in Argentina, it's a desert, the grapes are growing on the side of the Andes. And if there wasn't the water coming from the Andes and being collected and used in the vineyard for irrigation, nothing would grow here. This is not a hospitable part of the world for things to grow. It's very, very dry. So he specialized in irrigation, and he had this idea for how to irrigate a vineyard, and he was trying to convince people to buy his irrigation, and no one wanted to listen to him at all. They all thought he was completely crazy. So he thought, well, I know what I'll do. I'll purchase a bit of land, I'll plant a vineyard, I'll put my irrigation in, and I'll show everyone that it is the best way to irrigate a vineyard. So he did exactly that, and that was the first vineyard that the Zuccardi family had. It wasn't really until the next generation, though, and the next generation was also Alberto Zuccardi. So Alberto's son was Alberto, so Alberto too. They really got into winemaking, and Alberto had two children, Jose and Sebastian, who now head up the business. And they actually now have three different parts to the vineyard, to the business. So Zuccardi being one of them, and the one that Sebastian heads up. There is another part that is imported into New Zealand that you will find at very much the value end of the market in our supermarkets through the country. And then the other winery, the third one that they have, is actually called Santa Giulia, and that's Giulia Zuccardi's project. And you'll find those wines at Glengarry this summer with luck. The boat just needs to sail its merry way down here, and we'll have those. But they're quite interesting because they're very different to Sebastian's that we're about to talk about, because the Santa Giulia, that's where you get a whole lot of natural wine and a whole lot of organic and all sorts of different things. Anyway, back to Zuccardi. So Zuccardi is very much headed up by Sebastian, and Sebastian's really taken it on adventure and been focused about expressing place. And the way that he's put together the range of the wines is all about looking at where it's grown and expressing that as purely as he can. So it's about individual sites, terroirs, and he's gone through and divided all the vineyards up into that bit produces wines that taste like that, that bit that produces wines that taste like that, and he's made a product list that is just exhaustive. What he's also done is the winery that I talked about that's amazing to go visit, that was built 12 years ago. He built it from the concrete or from the stones that came from the vineyard. And in doing that, they also built these amazing concrete eggs or cylindrical tanks to ferment the wine in. And there's a real focus on concrete for fermentation and maturation of these wines. I need to grab my glass. I can see someone said mint. Yeah, mint and pesto. Yeah, there is a green character, and that is probably coming from the grape variety here, because this is Malbec. And with that grape variety, there is often a sort of a green character to it, which will be coming through as mint or pesto for sure. So this is 100% Malbec, and it comes from Gualtallary, which is a high altitude area. It's, if you sort of had to take the part of the region that was the most prized, this is it. This is where everyone wants to have a vineyard. And they, from this area, you get a wine that is very pure, very unique, and very much about the high altitude and that particular space. So I'll just have a quick taste before I go on. I've got a lot of information for you about this. Wow. Pretty impressive, isn't it? 2016 vintage for this. 2016 was a very unique and very complex harvest. It was actually the shortest and the smallest since 1960. A very cool year. And I think that sort of minty pesto character is also coming from the fact that this is Malbec grown in a cool year. So cool year and altitude are probably enhancing that characteristic in it. It was a very wet winter, wet spring as well, and actually they were very worried about disease pressure. But the low yield that ensued from that countered the fact of any disease pressure. Why it was such a short vintage is there was a frost on the 26th of April. So that's like us having a frost in the middle of our summer. It's absolutely unheard of. It was very, very odd. And really did affect the timing of this vintage. The production of this wine, the grapes are all moved by gravity, so there is no manual pumping or forcing the grapes anywhere. It's all gravity. It's fermented in concrete, and the concrete has come from the land that the winery has been built on. It's natural yeast, so they've not added any yeast. They've just waited for it to happen. It's been fermented in the concrete, and then it's gone a small amount to barrel, and most of it being matured in the concrete, and it's completely unfiltered. So being unfiltered, it's also vegan friendly because they haven't had to filter it with anything. Interesting, from tasting it, who would think, would you think it is bone dry or it has a little bit of sugar? It's quite, I mean, Argentinian wine, it's going to be quite ripe, but does anyone think there's any sugar there? Yeah, we think there's some sugar, some sweetness to it. Yes, yeah, it does have 2.01 grams to be precise. It's quite unusual for them to leave sort of some residual sugar in it, but this is, you know, a natural approach to things. Someone said before, really grippy tannins. I think one of our challenges with Malbec in New Zealand is that for a lot of years, what was imported here was very cheap, fruity, drink now Malbec, and it wasn't what Malbec can be. And Malbec in the right hands can produce wines with impressive tannins, massive acidity, huge structure, and very long-lived wines. And, you know, we tend to think of Malbec as being a drink now style, and it, you know, it should be cheap and it should be quaffed. It can produce some of the greatest wines in the world. It's just that until recently, we haven't seen a lot of those here in New Zealand and haven't been familiar with them. Yeah. What do you reckon, Regan?
Yeah, I love this wine. This is the first time I've tried it. I was telling you before, Liz, I did a Zuccardi tasting on Instagram on Tuesday and did the Q Malbec, which of course is all matured and aged in barrel. And then I did the Concreto. And the Concreto was a wine that really was a really important wine for Zuccardi because it was the first one that they had entirely fermented and aged in these concrete eggs. There was no oak whatsoever. And their kind of trials with Concreto have basically led into this wine and into the Piedra Infinita, and then giving them the confidence to make those really top wines with that higher proportion of concrete. Or in fact, I think the new vintage of Piedra Infinita is 100% concrete. But tasting that wine on Tuesday night, as opposed to tasting it again, some of it on Wednesday and Thursday, just got so much better over the next couple of days. And you can see that this wine's going to do the same. I mean, this needs a massive amount of air to open up. And I love the intensity and the purity of it, though. Like, it's super impressive. I just want to see what it's like in a couple of days. So.
You'll have to see if you can keep yourself a little bit. Yeah, it's an impressive wine. The Zuccardi wines are just amazing. And, we won't go into critics' scores too much, other than to say, this sort of sits from 97
They're very high.
up. Sorry? They're high. They're really, really high. Yeah, it's just sort of off the scale in terms of what the critics are saying about these wines at the moment. And you can see why. I mean, that stands up with the very best in the world. Impressive wine. Right, what's next, Regan?
Yeah, pretty much all of these new school wines that are coming out of that area around Mendoza and then high altitude Argentina are just all really, really good. And incredible quality for the price, right through the range, like right up to this $150, $200 a bottle. If you're paying $200 a bottle for it out of Argentina, it's going to be like a $500 wine out of France. So really, really impressive. Right, so we're staying in South America, but now we're going to Argentina, and we're going to the Emiliana Coyam, and Emiliana is located in Casablanca, of all places. So this is a winery that is one of the most famous organic and biodynamic wineries in the entire world. So it certainly wasn't always the case here, and biodynamics is reasonably new to Chile. But what happened was they started doing some organic and biodynamic winemaking as a trial, basically. And they started to not only see a difference in the wines, but also a difference in the people who were making the wines, a difference in the quality of the insects, the other animals that lived in the vineyards, all the different weeds that grew in between. Everything started to be better. And so they started moving more and more vineyards over. And so this is not just a way of growing grapes here. This is a way of working that basically creates happier people for the whole community. So they've got vegetable gardens that they've actually got set in between the vineyards that are given to the workers. And because in certain circumstances, they literally can't afford to pay them anymore. But what they can do is they can give them extra things like organic fresh veggies and things like that. They've got alpacas, chickens, hens, all living on the site here. So it's a really family atmosphere here. And I think when they first started, it was the end of the 1990s, it was about 1997, 1998. And they started to see these changes. And the two guys who set it up, two brothers actually, Rafael and Jose Gualtallary, they were visionaries in Chile and perceiving that the world market for wine was changing, right? And global consumers were starting to consciously choose the products they were consuming, not just in terms of quality, but also in terms of their health and the environmental and the social effects. And so they paired together with a very, very famous winemaker called Alvaro Espinosa, and they started to convert this conventional Chilean winery into this 100% organic and biodynamic winery. And so they wanted to create some of the greatest wines in Chile, but also respect the people and respect the environment as well. So that was obviously more than 2 decades ago now, and they've been working their way all the way through. I think in 2001, they were the first winery in Chile and only the 6th or 7th winery in the entire world to get the ISO 14001 certification, which is environmental management. And so all of their grapes and their organic production systems are all certified by IMO in Switzerland. They launched the first organic wines on the market in 2003. And this particular wine, the Coyam, was the first one to be launched. So it's always kind of been their flagship wine. That was their inaugural release. I think the first vintage was 2001, but the first organic vintage was 2003. Then in 2006, they released their first wine that had biodynamic certification from Demeter. in Germany. And I think in 2009, this particular wine here, Coyam, this was the second wine in Chile after their own wine to be certified biodynamic. So this is a certified biodynamic, certified organic wine as well. They've been Green Winery of the Year, Global Winery a number of times. They got the Carbon Zero certification in 2014. They were Winery of the World in 2015. So I think one of the world's top 50 most admired wine brands. They've been in that list since 2018 going onwards. So these guys have been doing some awesome stuff. So as far as vineyards go, they've got a lot of vineyards. They're based in Casablanca, but they've got 1,000 hectares of vineyards that are all managed either, everything's organic and some of them are biodynamic as well. So they're across the whole region. But where we're looking at for this particular wine is the Colchaga Valley. So this is part of an inland valley called the Raphael Valley. So we're probably maybe 25 kilometers from the sea here, but you still get quite a strong mix of ocean breezes coming in from this way. And then you get these winds coming down from the Andes Mountains as well. So it's all red grape varieties they're growing in this region. Syrah, Carmenere, Cab Sav, Merlot. You've got really accentuated seasons in here, and they've got 2 big winemaking facilities in this region as well. Now, you will have noticed on here, there is a lot of different varieties in this. So we've got 38% Syrah, 33% Carmenere, 8% Cab Sav. Now there's actually, I think there might be some other things that I didn't add in here. 5% Carignan, 4% Malbec, 4% Grenache, 3% Tempranillo, 3% Petit Verdot, and 2% Mourvedre. So it was actually quite difficult to find out exactly what was in this wine because they call it an assemblage. It's an assemblage of all of the grapes that they grow in the Colchaga Valley. And we're reasonably high here, but nowhere near as high as we're talking with Zuccardi. So those Zuccardi vineyards, they're at 1,000 to 1,100 meters above sea level. Here in Colchaga, we're in 250 meters above sea level. So high for New Zealand, but not high for South America. Reasonably old vines here though, planted 1992, 1995, and then again, some of them in 1998 and 2000. So the youngest vines that go into this now are still over 20 years of age. Now, this section kind of the mountains, or it's at the base of the slope of the mountains. You've got basically volcanic soils here. So you've got red granite, andesite, basalt, rhyolite rocks, all of that in there. And you've got abundance of these big stones on the surface. So this means that the root system, it's really easy for them to reach these great depths because there's no solid level of rock. There's lots of these big stones and the roots will work their way down kind of between them. And you're really close to the river as well. So you've got a lot of sand and a lot of silt kind of sitting in between there. Almost no organic matter, so almost no soil. We're talking 3% organic matter. So there's hardly any soil at all. This is rock, really rocky terrain. And the climate is Mediterranean. So this particular growing season, 2018, 2019, they had 490 mils of rain. So it's a very, very dry region here. And we're seeing really hot temperatures in the summer up into that 38, 39 degree kind of temperature range. So reasonably high. Now, everything that comes in here, obviously all picked by hand. They do a lot of different stages of sorting when they do this wine. So it first goes onto a conveyor belt. They remove all the leaves and any of the bunches that they don't think are up to scratch. Then that goes onto another conveyor belt that goes onto a machine that destems and does a vibrating table sizing. Then they go through another machine and another hand sorting. Everything into stainless for fermentation. Clearly, it's only going to be indigenous yeast here, all natural yeast. There's no inoculation. All the varieties and all the vineyards are kept separately. So maceration times are different depending on the varieties. All goes through Malo and they age it for 18 months. So 75% of the wine goes into classic French barrels. They're 225 litre French oak barrels. And that's a mix of new, second and third use barrels. Then 15% of the wine goes into these massive foudres. So 2,000 litre foudres and 5,000 litre foudres. And then you've got 10% of it is aged in concrete eggs. And again, a little bit like Zuccardi, they're doing more and more experimentation with the eggs. And I think we're going to see a much higher percentage in this wine going forward. Aging potential of this wine probably easily 10 years or so. But I think this is, for the price, this is a standout wine every single vintage. So I haven't given it a taste yet, but I've just been smelling it. You've got some of those characters of Bordeaux coming through, and then you've got some of those really like stony characters that we saw in the Zuccardi coming through on the nose as well. But really complex. Obviously, we've got so many different varieties in here.
It's an excellent wine, Regan, and I think, you know, someone's just commented there on the ethics behind it. I think the very cool thing with it is, you know, converting to bio dynamic production. It's quite common, unfortunately, I think, to see producers often start, you know, with a wine that is not their icon. You know, let's just start with that bit over there, and if it doesn't work, then, you know, it won't affect the rest of what we're doing. This is actually the wine that they started converting first, and they had the courage to actually take their icon and convert that to biodynamic. And part of it was that there was a lot of I guess the workers who were saying, you know, this is a lot more work. We don't think this is going to actually be a difference. You know, what are you doing here? And when the workers tried the Coyam produced biodynamically or initially produced organically, they started to see the difference. And, you know, it takes a lot of courage to convert your icon wine that you've built a reputation on over. So, yeah, it's very cool.
I mean, it's just,
great wine.
It's delicious, isn't it? I mean, it's almost like the ultimate barbecue wine. It's got everything you want. You can drink it now, you can age it, and it's something you can take along, and it's a really classy wine that everyone's going to be impressed by. You can enjoy, but like people who don't drink great wine can still appreciate it, you know, because man, it's just so good straight off the bat.
Yeah, Jacob, you're right. The disease pressure in a hot climate like Chile will be very different to somewhere like Bordeaux, where, you know, sure, it's relatively marginal anyway, and makes a big difference for sure. And yeah, Anne-Marie, the Chateau Neuf feel, you know, so many different grape varieties blended together. There's some similarities there for sure. And I think texturally in the wine there is. Cool. Excellent. Very, very good. Should we go to the last one? Yeah. Okay. So we're back to Portugal. And the good news is that you don't get the history of Portuguese wine again because you've already had it. And you don't need to hear about Quinta de Noval as a producer because we've done that as well. But what we haven't talked about is port and what is port. So we're going to do that very quickly because port is a fortified wine. And this last one is fortified. So you're going to be looking at something with a higher alcohol, and it also is going to be sweet. So what do we mean by fortified wine? Well, port production, essentially, the grapes are picked, they come in, and it's a very rapid maceration of them to extract the colour from the skins and also the tannin. So that's done by putting them into very large concrete lagères or big concrete vats, and it is still traditionally done in most of the port houses, including here at Quinta de Noval, by linking arms with the person beside you and stomping up and down. And that action of stomping up and down on the grapes extracts the colour and extracts the tannin from the skins. That happens very quickly, and it gets very warm as they're doing that. And then the fermentation will start, but it is stopped by adding a grape spirit to it. And it's stopped at a point that retains the sugar level. And by adding the grape spirit, it results in something that has a higher alcohol. So it's stopped to retain about 90 grams per litre of residual sugar, and it will reach about sort of 19% alcohol. because the fermentation is stopped very early on, it also retains in the wine a lot of fruit characters. So you should with this get an abundance of fruit, a sweetness, and yes, some alcohol. So that's basically how port is made. You then get different styles of port, from ruby, which is your sort of standard style of port, which is very fruity, bright red, through to tawny, which is then aged to become more tawny style, through to a vintage style, which a vintage then comes from 1 year and is aged basically like a red wine, but it is a fortified style. Now, this one is none of those. This is called a black port. So what on earth is a black port? Well, this is a new style, and it's Quinta de Noval trying to produce something that is a bit funkier, a bit ready to drink now, an easier to approach style, because let's face it, Portuguese wine, Portuguese fortified wine or port wine, it's a little bit like sherry and a little bit like, sadly, Sauterne. For some reason, we don't drink enough of it. So they're trying to make something here that we can perhaps approach earlier and we can remember to drink more often. So it is a combination of 2 to 3 years, in this case 3 years for this particular bottling, and it is fruit that was destined to be vintage port, but the year wasn't declared as a vintage year, and it's been blended together in a drink now style. The grape varieties in this are Touriga Nacional that we looked at in the red wine before, Touriga Franca, Touriga Rorez, Tinta Chao, and Sarzo as well. So all indigenous grape varieties, but the fact that Touriga Nacional is in here and in a high percentage really does speak to the quality of this, because Touriga Nacional is usually only put in the finest of vintage ports. It's very prized. The fruit for this comes predominantly from Quinta de Noval's owned vineyards, and the other part of it comes from A-graded vineyards through the Douro. So have you had a taste? It's got everything you'd want from a vintage inspired port to drink right now. You know, normally with vintage port, when it's young, you know, the tannin and the acidity in it and the concentration sort of leaves you wondering why you opened it and running to put any remaining bottles in the cellar and forget them to 20 to 30 years and ideally 50 to 60. But, you know, time's not on everyone's side for that. So this is a style that you don't need to age. It is a style that you can drink now. And yep, Anne-Marie, I do have some dark chocolate in the fridge and I'm heading there afterwards with this. What do you think, Regan?
Yeah, it's a really pure expression of Quinta de Noval, I think. And probably, I think, best drunk a little bit chilled as well, rather than room temperature as you would drink a vintage port. Yeah, really nice, really different. I like the style. It's like a intense ruby, you know.
It's not a Quinta, so we've been importing Quinta de Noval for a while and have their full range, but this is one of their ports that we didn't have and decided to add it in recently, and certainly very, very pleased that we did. It's yeah, it's a great style, and I think it again fits a nice price point where, you know, it's not at that vintage scale, and it's yeah. Okay, yeah, and Stephen will send chocolate next time.
Yeah, usually if you're drinking a ruby, or if you're drinking a ruby style from Quinta de Noval, it's going to be much lighter than this, a lot more elegant, a lot softer, you know, a very different thing. You're right, it's more like a vintage port, but it's not like an LBV that has those big tannins, you know, that can still do with some age. You know, this is like a, yeah, like they've stripped off just the top layer off a really nice LBV or that, and they've left all the structure behind, so you can just enjoy the fruit.
Yeah, for sure. Cool. So folks, that does bring us to the last wine for tonight's tasting. I've certainly really enjoyed tasting through those, and I think it's been really good to look at the diversity between the different wines as well. You know, we quite often will do a session and it's all about Bordeaux, or it's all about Argentina, or it's all about Chile. And, you know, you sit there and we're talking about, you know, this could stand up against the best wines from other regions. Well, I think what we've just showed tonight is there's, you know, 8 very, very different wines that are all just absolutely brilliant in terms of where they sit in the world of fine wine. And, you know, each one of them's got a great story behind it and is looking really good tonight. Some questions I see there, I'll just answer them in 2 seconds while